Roman emperors once seasoned their food with spices from islands on the other side of the planet. This was the reality of ancient trade corridors, hidden networks that connected our world thousands of years before airplanes or the internet. By the end of this story, you will see human history not as separate chapters, but as a single, interconnected volume. How did a single sunken ship rewrite our understanding of the Bronze Age? What do the genes in a chicken bone reveal about an ocean crossing we never recorded? We are about to reconstruct these forgotten pathways, using clues from the deep sea and our own DNA to uncover a past of stunning globalization. What does it mean for us today to learn that our ancestors were never truly alone? But what exactly are we looking for when we say a trade corridor is forgotten? The term itself is a clue. These were not just old roads that eventually grew over with grass. A forgotten corridor is something far more profound. It is an entire network of exchange, a web of relationships between distant cultures whose very memory was somehow lost to time. Think of it like a conversation between two people that happened thousands of years ago. We have found a few scattered words from that conversation, a bead here, a pottery fragment there, but for centuries we failed to recognize they were part of a dialogue at all. These pathways thrived in the deep past, often long before the rise of empires we know from textbooks. They were overshadowed by later, more famous routes, like the grand narrative of the Silk Road, which can act like a historical spotlight, leaving everything else in darkness. The Silk Road is well documented with written records and known cities, but what about the routes that came before it or operated alongside it in different parts of the world? Their existence challenges a comfortable assumption that ancient societies were mostly isolated, developing in their own little bubbles. Reconstructing these corridors forces a paradigm shift, a complete change in perspective. We must start seeing every ancient village, every port, not as a lonely outpost, but as a potential node in a vast intercontinental system. A single seashell found far inland is no longer just a curiosity. It becomes a data point. A unique style of metalwork appearing in two separate continents is no longer a coincidence. It is evidence. This mindset transforms archaeology from a study of individual sites into a global detective story. With this conceptual framework in place, we can begin to listen to the silent witnesses, the ones that have been waiting at the bottom of the sea. The most direct testimony comes from the deep, from ships that never reached their destination. For thousands of years, the ocean floor has preserved these moments of interruption, creating perfect time capsules of commerce. When a vessel sinks with its hold full, everything stops. The trade deal, the journey, the lives of the crew, all freeze in that instant. And what archaeologists find is not a random collection of goods, but a curated cargo, a business inventory that tells us precisely what was valuable enough to ship across treacherous seas. One of the most eloquent of these silent witnesses is the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the southern coast of Turkey. It settled on the seabed in the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BCE, a time when many history books still portray the world as a series of isolated kingdoms. Yet this one ship's hull contained a map of the ancient world. There were 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus. There was tin, a metal vital for making bronze, which geological analysis suggests came all the way from Afghanistan. There was ebony wood from Nubia in Africa, amber beads from the Baltic region in northern Europe, and glass ingots from Mesopotamia. Think about that for a moment. In a single wooden vessel, you have materials from Scandinavia, Central Asia, the African interior, and the Middle East, all sailing past the coast of what is now Turkey. This was not a simple point-to-point trip. It represents a hub in a sprawling, sophisticated network. The Uluburun was a bulk carrier of its day, a floating warehouse connecting suppliers and consumers across continents. Modern underwater archaeology lets us read this sunken ledger with incredible precision. Using sonar to map the site and meticulous excavation techniques, researchers can piece together how the cargo was stacked, what the ship was made of, and even what the crew ate. This allows us to reconstruct more than a shipwreck. We rebuild the economic web it served. We see that a ruler in Mesopotamia could commission a palace decorated with African ebony and Baltic amber, using tools of Cypriot copper and Afghan tin. This level of interconnectedness forces a complete rewrite of our understanding of the Bronze Age. It reveals a pre-globalized world where cultures were in dialogue through materials long before they ever exchanged letters or diplomats. From these tangible, physical snapshots of trade, we turn to a more subtle but equally pervasive form of evidence, one written not in clay or copper, but in the very code of life itself. While the Uluburun's cargo speaks of luxury and industry, another form of evidence reveals a quieter, more fundamental exchange. Ancient trade moved more than objects, it moved life itself. The seeds of crops, the DNA of animals, and the genetic markers within human populations act as biological fingerprints, tracing connections that potsherds and ingots can only hint at. This is the domain of archaeobotany and archaeogenetics, sciences that listen to the whispers carried in a single grain of charred wheat or a fragment of bone. Imagine a farmer in ancient India, thousands of years ago, planting a handful of seeds given to them by a traveler from a distant port. Those seeds, perhaps a type of millet originally from Africa, take root in a new continent. Centuries later, an archaeobotanist sifting through soil at that very site uncovers those charred grains. That tiny, carbonized plant is not just a clue about diet. It is a direct message from a forgotten exchange, proof that ideas and sustenance traveled together across the Indian Ocean long before history books say such journeys were possible. We see the same pattern in reverse with crops like bananas and taro, originating in Southeast Asia, appearing in the archaeological record of East Africa over 2,000 years ago. These were not random acts of nature, but deliberate transfers, likely nurtured and protected on long voyages because they held value. This was a trade in the very building blocks of a society, in food security and agricultural knowledge. The movement of people and the animals they cherished tells an even more intimate story. Archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, allows us to trace these journeys. Consider the humble chicken. Its wild ancestor is the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia. For a long time, historians believed chickens spread to Europe and Africa relatively late, carried by Roman or later medieval traders. But genetic analysis of ancient chicken bones tells a different, far older tale. The DNA evidence suggests chickens made their way westward not in one dramatic migration, but through a slow, branching network of maritime trade, hopping from island to island and port to port across the Indian Ocean. They were likely valued not initially for their meat or eggs, but for their ritual or symbolic significance, perhaps used in ceremonial practices. Their genetic trail, left in bones found from Vietnam to Romania, maps a corridor of cultural exchange that written records never noticed. This biological evidence creates a map of connectivity that is profound in its simplicity. It shows us that trade was never just about economics or luxury. It was about sharing the very components of life, from the food that sustained communities to the animals that held meaning for them. This constant, slow-motion exchange of biology laid a foundation upon which empires could later be built. And sometimes, the most vivid proof of these connections isn't found in a seed or a bone, but in the stories people told to explain the world around them. The story of ancient trade is also written in the language of the objects themselves, in their very substance. Every artifact, from a humble bead to a royal scepter, contains a hidden record of its birthplace, a chemical fingerprint that modern science has learned to decipher. This is the power of provenance and material analysis. Through techniques like isotopic analysis, researchers can now trace a piece of marble back to the exact quarry it was cut from, or pinpoint the specific mountain where a lump of metal ore was mined. It turns a beautiful object into a historical document, one that recounts an incredible journey. Take Lapis Lazuli, for instance. This stunning blue stone, the color of a deep night sky, was among the most coveted materials in the ancient world. It adorned the funeral mask of Tutankhamun and filled the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamian kings. For a long time, scholars knew it was rare and traveled far, but the science now confirms a staggering truth. Every single piece of Lapis Lazuli found in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean traces back to one singular, remote source, the mines of Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan. This means that for over 2,000 years, a vibrant blue stone was being hauled from a single valley in Central Asia, across towering mountains and arid deserts, to finally rest in a pharaoh's tomb thousands of miles away. That journey did not happen by accident. It required a stable, organized, and likely very lucrative corridor of exchange. Think of the chain this implies. Miners in Afghanistan extracted the raw stone. Local traders transported it to a central hub. From there, it passed through countless hands, perhaps moving by donkey caravan to the Indus Valley, then by ship up the Persian Gulf, and finally overland to the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. Each transfer represented a negotiation, a shared language of commerce, and a mutual understanding of value. The stone itself became a currency of prestige and the divine. When an Egyptian artisan inlaid it into the eye of a statue, they were not just decorating, they were connecting their god to a distant, almost mythical landscape. By mapping these material journeys, we inevitably meet the architects of the system, the individuals who made such vast distances feel small. These vast networks of stone and seed were held together by people. We often picture ancient trade as a transaction between two great empires, Egypt and Mesopotamia, Rome and China. But between every great power stood the essential connectors, the cultures who mastered the spaces in between. The Phoenicians are the celebrated maritime merchants of the Mediterranean, but they were not alone. Consider the Meluhans, a people from the great Indus Valley civilization. Their distinct square seals, carved with intricate script and animal figures, have been found in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities hundreds of miles away. They left no grand monuments on foreign soil, just these small, stamped signatures of commerce, proof that their merchants lived and worked in the heart of a distant civilization, facilitating the flow of goods. Then there are the enigmatic sea peoples, whose names echo in Egyptian records that speak of upheaval and movement across the Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. While often framed as raiders, many historians now suggest their migrations were deeply tied to the collapse of the very trade networks we've been exploring. They may have been not just destroyers, but displaced communities, sailors and traders caught in a web of failing alliances and shifting economic winds. To reconstruct these corridors is to give a voice back to these intermediary societies, to recognize them not as peripheral barbarians, but as the central engineers of early globalization. Their expertise was not in building pyramids, but in building bridges, both metaphorical and real. For a truly breathtaking scale of connection, we must look to the greatest navigators in human history, the Austronesians. Starting from what is now Taiwan over 5,000 years ago, these incredible seafarers embarked on voyages that defy modern imagination. In double-hulled canoes, guided by intimate knowledge of stars, winds, and ocean swells, they sailed across thousands of miles of open Pacific. They didn't just stumble upon islands, they systematically explored and settled them, carrying with them a package of life, taro, yams, chickens, and dogs. Their linguistic trail is the map, Languages descended from a common Austronesian root are spoken from Madagascar off the coast of Africa all the way to remote Easter Island. This was not trade in the traditional sense, but a trade in existence itself, a transfer of entire cultures across a water world. These maritime societies understood the ocean not as a barrier but as a highway. Their success, and the success of all these forgotten middlemen, hinged on a form of technology so advanced it became invisible, the very art of finding their way. The vast ocean highway demanded a different kind of map, one not drawn on parchment but remembered in stories and written in the sky. To reconstruct these forgotten corridors, we must learn to read the world as ancient sailors did, through a living science of observation passed down through generations. This is the realm of ethno-astronomy and indigenous navigational lore, a sophisticated body of knowledge that turned the terrifying emptiness of the open sea into a familiar, navigable grid. The most stunning example of this survives today in the Pacific, in the practice of Polynesian wayfinding. For these master navigators, the journey begins long before the canoe leaves the shore. They memorize a mental star compass where specific stars rise and set over specific islands. But the stars are just one point of reference. They learn to read the subtle patterns of ocean swells, feeling how they bend around islands even when land is far beyond the horizon. They watch for the flight paths of certain seabirds, knowing how far they travel from their nests. They note the color of the clouds and the taste of the wind. This is not magic, it is an empirical science built on millennia of accumulated experience, a database of environmental cues held in human memory. It is our clearest living window into how ancient mariners, from the Phoenicians to the Meluhans, could undertake voyages of staggering distance without a single modern instrument. This oral tradition finds a written counterpart in guides like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greco-Roman sailing manual for the Indian Ocean from the 1st century. It reads like a captain's log, listing ports in order, noting the goods available, describing landmarks, and estimating sailing times between points. By taking these ancient descriptions and matching them to modern geography, we can begin to plot the real-world routes of the spice and incense trade. But the true breakthrough comes when we combine this traditional knowledge with modern technology. Using computer simulations, scientists can model ancient wind patterns and ocean currents for any given season. When they feed in the sailing characteristics of a Bronze Age ship or a Polynesian canoe, the computer can suggest the most probable, efficient routes between 2 points. Often, these simulated paths align perfectly with the locations of ancient shipwrecks or the spread of archaeological finds. This fusion of old lore and new science transforms legendary voyages from myth into plausible, even predictable historical reality. It reveals that these routes were not random wanderings, but deliberate choices that harnessed the planet's own rhythms. These sailors followed geographical gifts, the consistent trade winds and reliable currents that acted as natural conveyor belts across the globe. The wind and the rock were the first architects of these global networks. Geography did not merely suggest a path, it commanded one, with a logic as unyielding as a mountain range and as predictable as the seasonal monsoon. Trade corridors were not drawn by kings on parchment. They were discovered by merchants and herders following the path of least resistance across a living, breathing planet. They flowed through mountain passes that offered the only safe passage. They clung to river valleys that provided water and fertile land, and they stretched across deserts from one life-giving oasis to the next. The map of ancient exchange is, in its purest form, a map of geographical opportunity. Consider the legendary Incense route. For over 1,000 years, camel caravans traced a deadly line across the empty quarters of the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a random crossing. It was a meticulously plotted survival trail, connecting the only places on Earth where the frankincense and myrrh trees would grow, in what is now Oman and Yemen, to the insatiable markets of Rome and Jerusalem. The route existed solely because the geography created both a rare product and an incredibly narrow, perilous corridor to move it. Every dune, every hidden well, every defensible canyon along that path was a known waypoint, a chapter in a manual written by the desert itself. Similarly, the Amber Road was not a single highway but a branching network that followed the great river systems of Europe, like the Vistula and the Danube. Amber, washed up on the Baltic coast, was lightweight and immensely valuable. The easiest way to move it south to the Mediterranean civilizations was by water, floating along rivers that acted as natural conveyor belts through dense, uncharted forests. The geography provided the route, and human desire provided the reason to travel it. To truly reconstruct these journeys, however, we must also reconstruct the world as it was. This is where paleoclimatology changes the story. The climate we know today is not the climate of 4,000 years ago. We now know the Sahara Desert, for instance, went through periods called green phases, when it was a landscape of savannas, lakes, and rivers. During these windows of time, the desert was not a barrier but a connective space. Different, more direct Trans-Saharan routes would have been possible, linking communities in the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean world long before the camel was introduced. A greener Sahara means we must look for evidence of trade in places that are now utterly inhospitable, imagining a time when the geography of connection looked completely different. The stage was never static. It shifted with the climate, and the trade routes shifted with it. Geography provided the immutable framework, the mountains and oceans that could not be moved. But within that framework, the script was written by the most powerful human motivations: the pursuit of wealth, the need for resources, and the deep, enduring hunger for the rare and the beautiful. The Silk Road was a latecomer to a much older conversation. For millennia before its official routes were mapped, the vast sea of grass known as the Eurasian Steppe served as the world's original superhighway. This was the Trans-Eurasian Steppe Corridor, a dynamic and often overlooked network that moved far more than just goods. It moved entire ways of life. Imagine a landscape stretching from the borders of China all the way to the fringes of Europe, an unbroken expanse of grassland that allowed for unparalleled mobility. This was the domain of nomadic pastoralists, cultures like the legendary Scythians, who mastered life on horseback. They were not isolated tribes, but the essential middlemen of the ancient world, the living, breathing infrastructure of a continental exchange system. Their mobility was their power. A Scythian rider could cover distances in weeks that would take a settled merchant's caravan months. They acted as cultural and economic conduits, connecting the great sedentary civilizations that blossomed on the steppe's edges. Chinese silks have been found in ancient Greek tombs near the Black Sea, and exquisite Greek goldwork appears in burial sites thousands of miles to the east. This flow of luxury items is the visible part of the story, but the steppe corridor's true legacy is written in the transmission of intangible, world-changing ideas. Technologies like advanced chariot warfare and the composite bow spread along these routes, reshaping armies from Egypt to China. Distinctive artistic styles, particularly the vibrant, coiled animal forms known as Scythian art, appear with stunning consistency from Mongolia to the Danube River. This suggests a shared visual language among the elite, a kind of international code of status and belief that was exchanged and adopted through alliances, marriages, and trade. The most compelling evidence for this interconnected steppe world comes from the silent, imposing burial mounds known as kurgans. Scattered across the grasslands from the Altai Mountains to Ukraine, these earthworks were the final resting places of nomadic chieftains and their kin. Archaeologists opening these mounds find a remarkable pattern. The burial rituals, the style of horse gear, the designs on weapons and jewelry, even the cuts of clothing preserved in the permafrost, all speak to a deeply connected elite culture. A chieftain buried in what is now Kazakhstan might be laid to rest with ceremonies and adornments nearly identical to those of a contemporary leader on the Pontic steppe, over 3,000 miles away. This was not a coincidence. It was proof of a corridor in constant use, a highway of ideas where status, spirituality, and identity were traded as actively as any bolt of silk or ingot of gold. The movement along this corridor also carried less visible but equally transformative exchanges. Researchers note that the steppe likely served as a conduit for the spread of certain illnesses, as the constant movement of people and animals created new pathways for germs. This aspect reminds us that connection always carries complex consequences, weaving together the fates of distant populations in ways both celebrated and unanticipated. The steppe corridor fundamentally proves that ancient trade was never just about material wealth. It was a circulatory system for civilization itself, pumping technologies, art, beliefs, and even biological challenges across the heart of the ancient world. From these windswept plains of constant motion, our search for forgotten pathways leads us into a seemingly opposite world, the dense, enclosing embrace of the tropical jungle. The winds that carried Scythian riders across the steppe were a world away from the seasonal monsoons that powered a different kind of trade empire. For over 1,000 years before European ships arrived, the Indian Ocean was a vast, liquid crossroads, governed not by emperors or armies, but by the predictable turn of the wind. This was the domain of the maritime spice routes, a network so sophisticated and lucrative that it made the Mediterranean seem like a local pond. The treasures that moved along these sea lanes were botanical gold, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon, spices so valuable they could fund kingdoms and inspire entire voyages of discovery. The real power, however, lay not in the spices themselves, but in the system that delivered them. This was a world built on knowledge, the intimate understanding that for 6 months the monsoon winds would blow steadily from the southwest, carrying ships from Africa and Arabia toward India and Southeast Asia. Then, as if by cosmic agreement, the winds would reverse, blowing from the northeast for the next 6 months, bringing those same ships home. This predictable rhythm created a clockwork of commerce. Sailors could plan voyages spanning thousands of miles with a confidence unknown in the stormy Atlantic, knowing they had a reliable return ticket written in the sky. At the heart of this system were the great entrepôts, the trading hubs where goods and cultures met. On the island of Sumatra, the kingdom of Srivijaya rose to dominate the strategic Strait of Malacca, the narrow funnel through which all traffic between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass. It grew wealthy not by producing spices but by controlling their flow, a maritime toll collector of staggering influence. Further north, the port of Baras on Sumatra's west coast became legendary as the sole source of the finest camphor, a rare resin prized across Asia and the Middle East for its fragrance and medicinal properties. To reconstruct this forgotten web, we must piece together a mosaic of clues left in the most unexpected places. A fragment of fine Chinese porcelain, discovered in the ruins of an 8th century Swahili stone town on the coast of Kenya, is not just broken pottery. It is a direct data point, proving that a bowl made in a kiln south of the Yangtze River ended its journey being used by a merchant family over 6,000 miles away in East Africa. Similarly, a stone inscription in the Tamil language found in a Thai port city records the donations of a South Indian merchant guild to a local temple. It is a receipt of faith and commerce, showing that traders were not just passing through, they were embedding themselves in foreign societies, building relationships that lasted generations. This is perhaps the most profound legacy of the Indian Ocean trade, the movement of ideas. Hinduism and Buddhism did not spread across Southeast Asia primarily through conquest or missionaries, but as passengers on merchant vessels. A trader from Gujarat might fund the construction of a Shiva temple in Cambodia, not as an act of conversion, but as a gesture of goodwill and a way to create a familiar spiritual anchor in a distant land. Over time, these anchors became foundations, and local elites adopted and adapted these beliefs, weaving them into magnificent kingdoms like Ankara. This was globalization with a different face, a multicultural exchange system that thrived on cooperation and mutual benefit, its stability enforced by the shared need to follow the monsoon schedule. Yet this maritime world of spices and shared winds was mirrored by another network of astonishing scale, one that moved not across water, but through the heart of a continent. The Indian Ocean spice winds were matched by a trade of equal weight and consequence, one that crossed a sea of sand. The Sahara Desert, far from being an empty wasteland, functioned as a vast, slow-moving ocean of its own, with caravan routes serving as its shipping lane. This was the Trans-Saharan network, a corridor powered by a simple, powerful imbalance. In the sun-baked heart of the desert, salt was life itself, a mineral essential for preserving food and sustaining health. Yet in the lush, forested kingdoms south of the desert, salt was desperately scarce. The opposite was true for gold. The riverbeds of West Africa, in regions like Wangara, held immense wealth in alluvial gold, but in the Mediterranean world to the north, gold was the ultimate symbol of power and piety. This created an irresistible economic gravity, pulling the two worlds together across 1,000 miles of the planet's most unforgiving terrain. Reconstructing these specific sandy trails is a monumental challenge for archaeologists. Unlike a stone road or a sunken ship, a desert trade route leaves almost no permanent trace. The shifting dunes swallow caravanserais, and the relentless wind erases footprints. The evidence, therefore, survives not in the path itself, but in the islands that dotted this sandy sea, the oases. Towns like Sijil Massa in southern Morocco and Oudakust in modern-day Mauritania were not just stops for water. They were cosmopolitan hubs where cultures and currencies met. At Sijil Massa, North African merchants would assemble their camel trains, loading them with manufactured goods, copper, and most importantly, slabs of precious salt mined from the desert's own heart. After a journey of months, they would arrive at southern terminals like Oudakust, where they would trade for gold, dust, ivory, exotic woods, and enslaved individuals captured in conflicts further south. These oasis towns grew fabulously wealthy on the taxes and services they provided, becoming glittering outposts of commerce in the wilderness. The true measure of this trade success, however, is best seen in the kingdoms it created. The wealth flowing north from the goldfields funded the rise of West Africa's most legendary empires, Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai. The Mali Empire's ruler, Mansa Musa, became the literal embodiment of this corridor's power during his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century. His caravan, reported to include tens of thousands of people and countless camels laden with gold, distributed so much wealth in Cairo that it reportedly depressed the value of gold in the region for years. His story was not just one of personal piety, but a dazzling display of economic might that placed West Africa firmly on the medieval world map. This corridor traded more than commodities, it traded entire civilizations. Alongside gold and salt-moved ideas, Muslim scholars and traders traveling with the caravans brought Islam, which was adopted by West African elites. This introduced Arabic literacy, transforming administration and scholarship. Distinctive architectural styles like the sudden, dramatic mosques built from sun-dried mud brick fused North African Islamic design with local building techniques, creating iconic structures like the Great Mosque of Janneh. The Sahara, therefore, was not a barrier that isolated sub-Saharan Africa. It was a dynamic bridge that connected it to the wider world, fueling empires and weaving a new cultural tapestry across the continent. While the Trans-Saharan routes are now well documented in historical records, other corridors remain ghostly outlines, their full stories waiting just beyond the reach of our evidence. The map of ancient trade still holds a blank space, a vast, silent ocean that challenges our entire narrative. The Atlantic and Pacific have long been portrayed as the ultimate barriers, absolute walls that kept the civilizations of the Old World and the Americas apart for tens of thousands of years. This idea of complete hemispheric isolation is a foundational pillar of mainstream history. Yet, a collection of tantalizing, fiercely debated clues suggests this wall might have had a few cracks. This is the most controversial frontier in reconstructing forgotten corridors, the possibility of pre-Columbian trans-oceanic contact. It is a field where a single piece of evidence can ignite decades of argument, forcing us to confront the very limits of how we know what we think we know. The clues are undeniably intriguing. Look at the pyramid, cultures separated by entire oceans with no known communication. Both arrived at the monumental stepped pyramid form, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the tombs of Giza to the towering temples of Teotihuacan and the Maya. Is this a case of independent invention, a logical architectural solution for reaching the heavens, or could it hint at a shared idea that somehow crossed the sea? Then there is the sweet potato. This starchy tuber is native to South America, yet archaeological and linguistic evidence shows it was present in Polynesia centuries before European explorers arrived. The Polynesian word for the plant, kumara, bears a striking resemblance to its name in some Andean languages. This suggests the plant, and possibly the people who knew how to cultivate it, made a journey across the Pacific. These are the kinds of puzzles that fuel the debate. On one side, skeptics rightly demand extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. They argue that similarities in pyramids or mythological stories are often superficial, the result of common human psychology facing similar challenges, a concept known as convergent cultural evolution. The mainstream academic position remains one of deep skepticism toward any theory of sustained, two-way contact that meaningfully influenced the course of American civilizations. The burden of proof, they insist, rests on those proposing the contact. Yet, the other side points to emerging scientific data that refuses to fit neatly into the old paradigm. Take the humble chicken, a bird we met earlier on its journey from Asia. For years, a controversial study claimed to have found pre-Columbian chicken bones in Chile, with DNA linking them to Polynesian varieties. While that specific claim has been heavily scrutinized and debated, it pushed researchers to develop more rigorous methods for dating and genetic analysis. Even more startling were reports from the 1990s of chemical tests on Egyptian mummies that detected traces of nicotine and cocaine, plants native only to the Americas. These findings, if verified, would be revolutionary, but they have been widely challenged on grounds of potential contamination or error in the testing process. This is the razor's edge of this investigation. Each potential piece of evidence becomes a lesson in scientific rigor. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Could ancient sailors have accomplished voyages we deem impossible? We know the Polynesians reached remote Easter Island, a speck in the eastern Pacific. Is it so unimaginable that on a long exploratory voyage, driven by wind and current, a few vessels might have made landfall in South America? The voyage might have been a one-way trip, a chance encounter rather than an established trade route, but it could have been enough to transfer a cutting of sweet potato or a breeding pair of chickens. Investigating this possibility is not about rewriting history with grand fantasies. It is about humility. It reminds us that the map of ancient human movement is still being drawn, and that the next discovery from a deep sea core, a genetic sequence, or a re-examined artifact could force a paradigm shift. To navigate this controversial space, we must employ the most rigorous methodology, treating each clue not as proof, but as a hypothesis to be tested without prejudice. This search for lost connections demands a new kind of detective. Reconstructing these corridors is not a job for a single archaeologist with a trowel, but for a multidisciplinary team, a fusion of traditional digging with tools that feel like they belong in a science fiction novel. Each forgotten path leaves a different kind of trace, and to follow them all, we must listen to geologists, linguists, geneticists, and climate scientists, all speaking a common language of discovery. Take the dense jungles of Central America, where centuries of growth have swallowed entire cities. Here, the key tool is LiDAR, a laser scanning technology mounted on aircraft. It pierces the leafy canopy to map the ground beneath, revealing ghostly outlines of ancient causeways, irrigation canals, and market plazas that have been invisible for 1,000 years. What looks like an unbroken green wilderness from the ground is shown from the air to be a carefully engineered landscape, crisscrossed with the infrastructure of trade. Meanwhile, in a quiet lab, a different laser analyzes something much smaller, a single human tooth. Strontium isotope analysis reads the chemical signature locked in the enamel, which forms in childhood and reflects the geology of where a person grew up. Finding a tooth with a foreign isotopic signature in an ancient burial tells us that individual was not local. They were a traveler, a migrant, or perhaps a trader who settled far from home, their body becoming the final proof of a journey no document recorded. We then take these scattered data points, the hidden road, the traveler's tooth, the far-flung pottery style, and feed them into another modern tool, network theory. This mathematical modeling helps visualize how these nodes of activity influenced each other. It can show us that a small port, based on its position, likely acted as a critical bottleneck controlling the flow of obsidian, or that the collapse of one central hub would have cascaded to destabilize communities hundreds of miles away. It turns abstract ideas of connection into dynamic, testable maps of ancient interdependence. The clues are not only in the ground or the bone, but in the words we still speak. Linguists track the spread of loanwords, tracing how the name for a prized commodity hops from language to language along a trade route. The journey of the word for silk, or pepper, or ivory becomes a linguistic fossil of the route itself. And underpinning it all is the work of paleoclimatologists, who reconstruct ancient weather patterns from ice cores and sediment layers. They can tell us when a prolonged drought might have made a desert crossing impossible, or when a favorable monsoon season opened a window for unprecedented maritime voyages. This collaborative approach transforms a historical mystery into a vast, interconnected scientific puzzle. The ceramicist talking to the geneticist, the linguist sharing data with the climate modeler. This holistic process beautifully mirrors the interconnectedness of the ancient world it seeks to understand. It proves that to reconstruct a forgotten corridor, all forms of knowledge must work in concert, each thread essential to weaving the whole tapestry. Armed with this powerful toolkit, we can finally move beyond mapping the routes to asking the most profound question of all: what was the true cost of this ancient web, and who paid the price? The true wealth of these ancient highways was measured not in gold or spice, but in the invisible cargo they carried. While merchants bargained over silks and incense, a far more transformative exchange was happening in the background, in the conversations between travelers sharing stories, in the observations of scholars comparing star charts, and in the quiet adaptations of artisans inspired by foreign designs. These corridors became the world's first information superhighways, transmitting the very building blocks of civilization itself across continents. Perhaps the most profound traveler along these routes was not a person, but an idea. Buddhism, born in northern India, did not spread by conquest or decree. It walked the Silk Road and sailed the monsoon winds. Monks and pilgrims became permanent fixtures in merchant caravans, finding safety and sustenance alongside traders. In the bustling caravanserais of Central Asia, A monk from Gandhara might explain the concept of karma to a Persian merchant over a shared meal. That merchant, in turn, would carry the story westward, while the monk continued eastward into China, his teachings gradually seeping into new soil. This slow, person-to-person transmission meant the belief system adapted, blending with local traditions to create new forms of expression, like the stunning Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara, where the Buddha was first depicted in human form, borrowing from the sculptural traditions of Hellenistic Greece. The exchange of knowledge was equally revolutionary. Our modern numeral system, including the concept of zero, is a gift from ancient Indian mathematicians. This brilliant, abstract idea of representing nothing as something was a leap of logic that revolutionized calculation. It did not stay in India. Arab scholars, deeply engaged in trade and astronomy with the subcontinent, recognized its power and adopted it. They refined and transmitted it through their own vast networks, from the markets of Baghdad to the ports of North Africa. By the Middle Ages, this system had entered Europe through centers of learning in Islamic Spain, eventually replacing the cumbersome Roman numerals and paving the way for the scientific revolution. A mathematical idea born in one corner of the world, carried on the currents of commerce, became the foundation for global science. This cultural blending was a constant creative process. In the marketplaces of Alexandria or the ports of Southeast Asia, an Egyptian glassblower might see a Roman mosaic technique and experiment with new patterns. A Chinese potter, inspired by the cobalt blue pigments brought by Persian traders, would create an entirely new ceramic tradition that we now call blue and white porcelain. Artistic motifs swirled and merged, a lotus flower from Indian art winding its way onto a textile in Byzantium, or a Chinese dragon acquiring new features as it traveled west. These were not acts of copying but of creative dialogue, a silent conversation between cultures conducted through craft and aesthetics. This transmission of ideas happened not in royal courts, but in the mundane spaces of human interaction. It was the slow work of generations, built on countless casual exchanges in a smoky tavern, a shared workshop, or on the deck of a ship during a long voyage. A sailor teaching a new knot, a farmer explaining a grafting technique for fruit trees, a healer sharing a recipe for a medicinal herb. These were the tiny, daily transactions that wove a shared fabric of knowledge across the ancient world. It demonstrates that the first globalization was at its heart a meeting of minds, and where minds and goods traveled, life in all its forms followed. These same bustling ports and caravanserais that exchanged philosophies and art also became junctions for a quieter, more relentless traveler. The very connectivity that enriched humanity also created pathways for biological exchange, with consequences that would reshape societies in ways no merchant could have foreseen. The same ships that carried cinnamon and silk also carried unseen passengers with a devastating impact. For all their wonder, these ancient highways had a shadow side, acting as superhighways for the spread of epidemic illness and ecological disruption. The connectivity that enriched cultures also made them profoundly vulnerable. One of the most studied examples comes from the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, when a mysterious illness, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through its territories. Historians tracing its path note that outbreaks seemed to flare first in port cities and along major military roads, following the very infrastructure that held the empire together. The disease likely entered through eastern trade hubs, a tragic side effect of the vibrant commerce with Arabia and India. This was not a one-time event but a recurring pattern of the ancient globalized world, where the speed of human movement could outpace a community's immunity. To reconstruct these paths of suffering, scientists now turn to paleopathology and the analysis of ancient pathogen DNA. By extracting genetic material from dental pulp in centuries-old remains, researchers can identify the specific strains of illnesses and trace their geographical spread over time, mapping the silent journeys of microbes alongside those of merchants. This biological exchange extended beyond human illness to reshape entire environments. The black rat, for instance, is not native to Europe. It spread across the continent as a stowaway in the grain shipments and trade goods of the Roman world, altering local ecosystems wherever it established itself. Similarly, the constant movement of caravans and carts along ancient roads acted as a dispersal mechanism for plants. Seeds of certain weed species, hitchhiking in animal fodder or in the mud on wheels and hooves, traveled hundreds of miles from their origins, slowly changing the botanical landscape. This was a slow-motion ecological exchange long before the dramatic transatlantic transfer known as the Columbian Exchange. Understanding this forces a more complete and more sobering picture of these networks. They were not merely channels for wealth and ideas, but complex systems that transferred all forms of life, with consequences both creative and catastrophic. This duality holds a powerful lesson for our own interconnected era. The ancient world experienced its own pandemics and ecological shifts, crises born directly from its success in bridging distances. Their networks faced collapse when the costs of connection, whether from rampant illness or the strain on resources, grew too high. This holistic view of trade, encompassing both its brilliant light and its long shadows, fundamentally changes how we interpret the rise and fall of the civilizations we think we know. The grand narrative of a lone, brilliant culture inventing everything in isolation begins to crumble. The artifacts we have admired for centuries in quiet museum halls now whisper a different story. That Mesopotamian cylinder seal, carved with intricate cuneiform, was not just a local administrative tool. Found in the ruins of a Harappan city in the Indus Valley, it becomes a passport stamp, a signature of a merchant or diplomat far from home. The obsidian blade in an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb, its volcanic glass traced to the highlands of Ethiopia, is no longer merely a sharp object. It is a receipt for a transaction spanning 1,000 miles of desert and river. And the luminous jade of a Shang dynasty ceremonial axe, its source pinpointed to mines in Central Asia, transforms from a symbol of royal power into a map of continental ambition. Each of these objects, studied in isolation for generations, was actually part of a conversation. This evidence forces a monumental shift in perspective. We must stop picturing the so-called cradles of civilization as separate nurseries, each independently inventing the blueprint for society. Instead, we should see them as the first major nodes in an ancient internet, buzzing with data packets in the form of goods, ideas, and people. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early China were not lonely geniuses. They were neighbors in a very large, interconnected neighborhood, watching each other, learning from each other, and competing with each other. This networked view fundamentally changes how we understand the very engine of human progress. Take the invention of writing. In the old model, it was a brilliant, isolated spark in Sumer, a purely local administrative solution to managing temple grain stores. But what if the idea itself was contagious? The concept of representing language with symbols, once observed by traders visiting from afar, could have ignited similar experiments in other centers of power struggling with their own complexity. We are not saying one culture copied another's alphabet. We are suggesting that the challenge of record-keeping was a shared problem, and the solution of symbolic notation was an idea whose time had come, circulating and mutating along those early trade corridors. The same could be true for metallurgy. The knowledge of smelting copper and alloying it with tin to create bronze did not need to be invented separately in 5 different places. It could have spread, a precious technological secret passed from master to apprentice, traveling with the very ingots that were being traded. The rapid adoption of bronze across Eurasia looks less like coincidence and more like the viral spread of a superior technology. Even the concept of the state itself, of centralized authority and social hierarchy, may have been reinforced and accelerated by this early connectivity. A ruler seeing the wealth and power that accrued to a neighboring king who controlled a trade route would be driven to consolidate his own power, to build his own infrastructure, to secure his own access to exotic goods that conveyed status. Competition and emulation, fueled by contact, could have acted as a catalyst for political complexity. This reframes all of human history as a collaborative project from the very start. Progress was not a series of isolated light bulbs switching on. It was a slow, collective campfire, with each culture adding its own fuel and sharing the warmth. The next time you see an ancient artifact behind glass, ask a new question. Do not just ask what it is or who made it. Ask where has it been, who held it before it ended up here. What conversation was it a part of? The answers are rewriting our story from the ground up. Walk into the hushed halls of a major museum, and you are standing in an archive of lost connections. Every glass case holds fragments of those global conversations, even if the neat typed label only tells a small part of the tale. That elegant Roman glass vase, glowing under soft light, is a chemical poem. Its very substance whispers of Egyptian sand, Syrian soda ash, and perhaps a dash of manganese from Spain, all fused together in a workshop that understood recipes from across the Mediterranean. It is not merely a Roman object, it is a Roman synthesis. Across the world, in a Tokyo museum, a serene statue of the Buddha stands with robes that fall in soft, realistic folds. This stylistic choice, so different from earlier abstract Indian depictions, is a direct artistic echo of the Greek sculptors who followed Alexander the Great into Central Asia centuries before. The corridor Alexander's armies blazed stayed open long after his empire faded, allowing an aesthetic idea to travel thousands of miles and merge with a spiritual tradition. This is the quiet revolution happening in museum basements and research labs today, a massive recataloguing project. Curators and scientists are no longer satisfied with labeling an artifact simply by where it was dug up. They are asking new questions. Where did the raw materials originate? What stylistic influences can be traced? Who might have made it, and for whom was it intended? This transforms a static collection into a dynamic database for planetary history. A single object becomes a node in a vast network, its story spanning continents and centuries. It invites us to look past the imposing beauty of the thing itself and see the invisible threads of exchange that brought it into being. Yet this method relies on things that were preserved, on materials durable enough to survive. But what of the trade in everything that rotted, evaporated, or was consumed? The most vital corridors might have dealt in goods that left almost no trace at all. The museum's quiet glass cases hold only the durable bones of the ancient economy. We see the stone, the metal, the fired clay, because those materials could endure the centuries. But what about the flesh of that economy, the vibrant, perishable goods that were often far more vital to daily life and royal prestige? Our historical vision suffers from a profound preservation bias. We have detailed records of the trade in marble and bronze, while the far more extensive commerce in textiles, feathers, exotic woods, spices, and foodstuffs has largely vanished from the physical record. These were the true luxuries and necessities, the scents, colors, and textures that defined status and comfort. Reconstructing these invisible corridors demands a form of archaeological detective work that operates at the microscopic level. Consider a corroded bronze brooch found in a Celtic chieftain's grave in Central Europe. To the naked eye, it is a green lump of metal, but under a microscope, a scientist might find the ghost of a fabric, mineralized fibers preserved in the corrosion products that sealed them away from decay. Those tiny threads could reveal the weave of a cloak, and if the fibers are identified as silk or a rare type of wool, they map a trade route in luxury cloth that written history never recorded. Similarly, the unassuming residue inside a humble pottery jar can be a chemical time capsule. Advanced residue analysis can detect the faintest traces of lipids, proteins, or alkaloids. A ceramic vessel from a Mayan site, once thought empty, might yield the chemical signature of cacao, proving it held a prized chocolate beverage. A Mycenaean drinking cup might whisper of ricinated wine, its tartaric acid still detectable after 3,000 years. We are literally tasting the echoes of ancient trade. Perhaps the most evocative of these ghostly commodities were living things. The trade in exotic animals for royal menageries or as symbols of power is a corridor almost entirely lost to time. We have fragments of accounts describing elephants from India arriving in Persian courts, or giraffes from Africa astonishing Chinese emperors, but the physical evidence is fleeting. How do you track the path of a parrot whose brilliant red and blue feathers were prized for ceremonial regalia across the Americas? You look for their pollen. Palynologists, scientists who study ancient spores and pollen grains, drill cores into the sediment of lake beds or bogs. As they analyze layer after layer, they can find a sudden, brief spike of pollen from a plant species not native to that region. This could mark the passing of a caravan of animals munching on fodder brought from their homeland, or the temporary residence of a foreign beast in a royal garden, its feed introducing alien pollen into the local environment. It is a whisper of passage, a biological shadow left by a creature that walked through history. Acknowledging this missing majority of ancient trade is an act of profound humility. It forces us to admit that the grand networks we painstakingly map with pottery and ingots were merely the skeleton. The full body of the ancient global economy was clothed in vibrant, vanishing materials that shaped cultures in intimate ways. The pursuit of these invisible corridors is not just an academic exercise. It pushes our scientific methods to their absolute limits, teaching us to read the faintest chemical and biological signatures. And in doing so, it offers a crucial lesson for our own time. Our modern global trade is still built on a flood of perishables, from fresh fruit to cut flowers, flowing along digital and containerized versions of those ancient routes. By learning how our ancestors managed, valued, and depended on these fragile commodities, we gain a deeper, more human understanding of what connectivity has always truly meant. The silent trade in feathers and fabrics reminds us that our ancestors' world was rich with connections we can barely see. This legacy is not locked in the past, it speaks directly to the world we live in now. Our modern globalized era, with its container ships and instant communication, often feels like a radical break from history. But the truth is, we are living in another chapter of a very old story. Globalization is not a modern invention, it is a recurring human condition. Ancient trade networks show us the enduring patterns, the profound benefits, and the sobering risks of a connected world. They achieved something we still strive for, fostering periods of remarkable peace and stability through sheer interdependence. When kingdoms relied on each other for tin, silk, or incense, the cost of conflict rose dramatically. Trade created a vested interest in cooperation, yet these systems were also fragile, exquisitely vulnerable to the very forces they helped to unleash. The end of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE serves as a stark case study. A convergence of factors, including climate shifts that disrupted agriculture, political unrest among major powers, and the movement of displaced populations, caused that interconnected world to fracture. The collapse was not isolated, it cascaded along those same trade routes, toppling empires from Greece to Egypt in what seems like a historical blink. Their vulnerability holds a mirror to our own. Our just-in-time supply chains and digital networks create incredible efficiency, but also systemic risk, where a disruption in one corner of the globe can ripple out with startling speed. Perhaps the most critical lesson lies in the concept of sustainability. Ancient networks were powered by wind, muscle, and current. They moved at the speed of a camel caravan or a monsoon sailing. This pace was not a limitation, it was a form of harmony. It forced adaptation to local environmental limits, knowledge of water sources, and respect for seasonal cycles. The Phoenicians did not clear-cut Lebanese cedars. They managed them as a precious resource for centuries. Compare that to our fossil-fueled model, which often treats distance and resource extraction as problems to be overcome with sheer energy, creating a disconnect between consumption and consequence. These old corridors teach us that true resilience is built on local knowledge and regional adaptation, not on overriding natural systems. Beyond economics and ecology, they demonstrate the undeniable engine of human progress, the exchange of ideas. The multicultural hubs of the Indian Ocean or the Silk Road were not just marketplaces, they were innovation labs, the blending of Greek and Indian thought, the transmission of mathematics from India to the Islamic world and then to Europe, the fusion of artistic styles from China to Persia. All of this was the direct result of connection. Progress has always been a collaborative project. By studying how past societies managed the delicate balance of interconnection, we are not just admiring history, we are mining it for models. We can look for inspiration in systems that valued long-term relationships over short-term gain, that built resilience through diversity of routes and partners, and that saw cultural exchange as a source of strength, not a threat. This understanding does more than inform policy, it fuels a new form of exploration. The greatest unmapped territories are no longer on our planet, they are in our shared past. The story of ancient trade is no longer confined to academic journals or museum archives. You can be part of this reconstruction because the new age of exploration is digital, collaborative, and open to anyone with curiosity. We are witnessing a profound democratization of discovery, where the tools once reserved for specialists are now shared with the global public. Platforms like Global Explorer invite volunteers to scan high-resolution satellite imagery, training their eyes to spot the subtle geometric shapes and soil discolorations that hint at buried structures, from lost pyramids in Peru to forgotten caravan stops in the Sahara. Every click by a citizen scientist is a vote for where archaeologists should look next, turning the search for our past into a planetary crowdsourcing project. This collective effort is amplifying our vision, allowing us to survey landscapes at a scale and speed that was once unimaginable. Meanwhile, in the digital realm, another quiet revolution is building connections. International databases are compiling the chemical fingerprints of artifacts, the unique isotopic signatures of metals, clays, and stones. When a researcher in Turkey uncovers an unusual bronze ingot, they can now query a global digital library. A match might appear with ore sources in Spain or tin mines in Cornwall, instantly sketching a trade link that would have taken decades of solitary research to prove. This instant provenance matching is weaving a web of data, transforming isolated finds into nodes on a vibrant, ever-expanding map of ancient exchange. The ancient world itself is being reborn as an interactive model. Digital humanities projects use geographic information systems, or GIS software, to layer data, topography, climate records, and archaeological finds onto one dynamic map. Scholars can run simulations, testing how changes in monsoon patterns might have opened or closed maritime routes, or modeling the most efficient paths between a Lapis Lazuli mine and a royal capital. These are not static maps, but living laboratories of the past. What does this all mean for you? It means that global history is becoming a participatory project. A teacher in Brazil, a student in Norway, or a retiree in Japan can, in their spare time, help classify pottery fragments from a Mesopotamian dig or transcribe a merchant's ledger from a scanned medieval manuscript. Each small contribution feeds a vast collaborative intelligence. The next clue that rewrites a chapter of human history might not be found by a professor in a trench, but by someone at their kitchen table, looking at satellite images on a laptop. This shifts the ownership of history itself from a distant academic discipline to a shared human story that we are all actively piecing back together. As we look forward with these powerful new tools, we must also ask with a sense of thrilling anticipation, what incredible discoveries remain just beyond the edge of our current knowledge, waiting for the right combination of technology, curiosity, and collective effort to bring them into the light. The next frontier for discovery lies not on any map, but beneath the canopy of the world's last great wildernesses. The dense, unmapped jungles of the Amazon and Congo basins are not empty spaces, but vast, living libraries of human history, their floors likely hiding the remains of sophisticated trade networks that moved forest products across continents. Similarly, the seabeds of the South China Sea and the Mediterranean are littered with the wrecks of countless vessels, each a frozen ledger of commerce waiting to be opened. Even the frozen tundra of Siberia, as permafrost thaws, is beginning to yield perfectly preserved artifacts and remains, offering snapshots of life along the northern steppe corridors. These regions are the final physical frontiers, but the true revolution is in how we will see them. Artificial intelligence is being trained to perform a task once thought uniquely human, pattern recognition on a colossal scale. An AI system can now scan tens of thousands of digital images of pottery fragments from museums across the globe, detecting subtle stylistic signatures, a curve of a handle, a density of cross-hatching, that link a pot found in Vietnam to one unearthed in Tanzania, revealing a cultural conversation no single archaeologist could ever piece together alone. Meanwhile, advanced DNA sequencing is moving beyond identifying species. Scientists can now extract genetic material from ancient seeds and even soils to trace the precise migration of a single crop variety across oceans, or to map the spread of pathogens along trade routes with the resolution of a family tree. Looking further ahead, quantum-level material analysis could achieve the ultimate goal of provenance. Imagine analyzing a single gold coin with such precision that you could match its unique atomic signature to the specific alluvial deposit in a West African river where its gold was panned, definitively charting its journey from source to final resting place. This fusion of cutting-edge technology with enduring human knowledge is where the future shines brightest. Satellite scans can identify a potential settlement, but it is often indigenous oral histories, passed down for countless generations, that explain its purpose. These stories preserve the names of ancient paths, the locations of seasonal meeting grounds, and the memories of alliances forged through exchange. They are not myths but living maps waiting to be correlated with the data from the sky and the soil. Yet this powerful convergence of tools also brings profound ethical questions to the surface. Who owns the story when a DNA sample reveals unexpected ancestry for a modern community? How do we balance the global pursuit of knowledge with the rights and sovereignty of indigenous peoples over their land and their ancestors' remains? The process of reconstructing these corridors must now include not just scientists and historians, but community elders and cultural guardians, ensuring the past is uncovered with respect as well as curiosity. A jade pendant unearthed in a museum vault may have a catalog number from a colonial expedition. The very act of uncovering these ancient pathways is entangled with a more recent, and often painful, history of how that knowledge was first collected. For centuries, the pursuit of the past was not a shared endeavor but an extractive one, where artifacts were removed from their landscapes and communities, becoming trophies in distant institutions while local narratives were silenced or overwritten. Today, reconstructing a forgotten trade corridor is not simply an academic puzzle. It is an ethical imperative that demands we ask, for whom are we rebuilding this history, and who has the right to tell its story? The ground we walk for clues is often land marked by layers of memory, where the shadow of colonial collection practices still lingers. This means modern archaeology must consciously operate differently, prioritizing partnership over possession. It begins with listening. Before a single test trench is dug, ethical reconstruction involves long conversations with local communities and descendant populations. Are there oral histories about this place, stories passed down about old roads or meeting grounds that might guide the research? What are the community's own hopes or concerns about this work? This collaborative approach transforms the process from one of taking to one of co-creation, ensuring the benefits of discovery, from economic opportunities in cultural tourism to the simple pride of reconnection, are shared equitably. The question of ownership becomes beautifully complex when a single ancient corridor spans multiple modern nations. Does the story of the Amber Road belong more to Poland or to Italy when it connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean? The ethical answer is that it belongs to the dialogue between them. Responsible reconstruction today seeks to build international teams of researchers, to create digital archives accessible to all, and to celebrate these routes as shared heritage, not as a source for modern political claim-making. Indeed, the revelation of deep past connections can ripple into the present in unexpected ways. An ancient trade link between two regions now in conflict can be framed as evidence of historic brotherhood or, conversely, of ancient domination. Recognizing this power, scholars have a duty to present findings with transparency and nuance, distinguishing evidence-based interpretation from modern ideological use. The goal is a multivocal story, one where the perspective of the farmer whose field holds the site is valued alongside the chemical analysis from the lab, where the song of a local elder about the old salt caravan carries the same weight as the satellite image. This ethical framework is not a limitation. It is what gives the reconstructed corridor its deepest meaning, reweaving not just routes of exchange, but relationships of respect. It prepares us to ask the most ambitious question of all, one that looks beyond the corridors we have found to the breathtaking possibility of those still hidden from view. The silent whispers of ancient trade can now be simulated. We have entered an era of predictive archaeology, where powerful computers do not just map what we have found, but model what we have yet to discover. By feeding vast datasets into simulation software, everything from wind patterns and river currents to the known locations of copper mines and the load capacity of a donkey, researchers can generate probability maps. These are heat maps of the past, showing not where trade artifacts are, but where the ancient logic of economics suggests they should be. It is a form of digital divination, grounded in hard data, that sketches the ghostly outlines of corridors for which we have no physical proof. Imagine programming a virtual landscape of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. You input the sailing characteristics of a vessel like the Uluburun, the seasonal winds, the locations of every known source of tin, copper, and luxury goods. Then you set the simulation to run, asking the computer to find the most efficient routes between supply and demand. The resulting pathways often align perfectly with the scatter of known shipwrecks, validating the method. But more thrillingly, the simulation might highlight a stretch of coastline with no known ports, yet which the model insists was a probable stopping point. This becomes a treasure map for field archaeologists, directing them to search for the submerged remains of a harbor or a settlement, turning speculative probability into tangible discovery. This modeling power allows us to ask profound what-if questions, treating history not as a fixed script, but as a complex adaptive system. What if a prolonged drought dried up a crucial oasis in the Sahara? The simulation can reroute virtual caravans, showing how traders might have shifted to a different chain of water sources. potentially explaining the sudden rise or abandonment of a town we find in the archaeological record. What if political conflict closed a key mountain pass on the Silk Road? The model can illustrate how goods would have funneled through alternative valleys, perhaps boosting the fortunes of a minor chieftain into a major power. These are not mere games. They teach us about the resilience and redundancy of these networks. They show that ancient globalization was not a single, fragile thread, but a web with multiple pathways. When one route was cut due to conflict, climate, or illness, the flow of goods and ideas would seek a new channel, often with lasting consequences for the communities along that new path. This speculative reconstruction culminates in a grand synthesis. We are no longer piecing together isolated fragments of pottery or metal. We are assembling a dynamic planetary system. The individual stories of the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean monsoons, the Trans-Saharan caravans, and the Pacific migrations begin to merge. They reveal a fundamental truth that for millennia, human societies have been engaged in a continuous, planet-spanning project of connection. This was not a linear progression from isolation to globalization. It was a pulsating, ever-changing web that expanded, contracted, and transformed, driven by climate, innovation, and sheer human curiosity. The old narrative of civilizations rising and falling in splendid isolation is replaced by a vision of a deeply interconnected human story, where a drought in Central Asia could ripple into famine in Egypt, and where a new ship design in Arabia could reshape economies in China. This interconnected past is the foundation upon which our modern world is built, not as a sudden revolution, but as the latest, fastest iteration of an ancient, enduring pattern. The map we have drawn from these fragments is not merely a collection of ancient shipping lanes. It is the blueprint for a new human story, one where connection, not isolation, writes the plot. For too long, our history has been taught as a series of brilliant but separate lights flickering on across the globe, as if Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and ancient China each invented civilization in a vacuum. The reconstructed corridors prove this idea is an illusion. They show us those lights were never separate at all. They were nodes in a vast, early network, illuminating each other across the continents. The true engine of progress was not genius in isolation, but the constant, quiet exchange that happened along 1,000 forgotten trails. A new alloy technique did not need to be discovered 5 separate times. It could travel with the ingots themselves, passed from smith to smith in the smoky workshops of port cities. An artistic motif, a philosophical concept, a mathematical principle, these were the most valuable and invisible cargoes, moving with the merchants and migrants who braved deserts and oceans. This changes everything. It means the rise of a great civilization was rarely a solo performance. It was a chorus influenced by melodies heard from distant lands. The fall of one could send shockwaves through the system, as we saw when Bronze Age networks collapsed, but the web itself persisted, reforming along new lines. This perspective shifts the focus from the clash of civilizations to their conversation, a dialogue conducted in goods, genes, and ideas over millennia. The ultimate reward of this painstaking reconstruction is therefore not just a more accurate timeline, it is a more humane one. It fosters a profound sense of global citizenship, rooted not in modern politics, but in deep history. It tells us that the farmer in Anatolia, the miner in Afghanistan, and the sailor in the Persian Gulf were already part of the same story 4,000 years ago, their fates intertwined by a shared need for tin, lapis, and grain. Recognizing this interconnected destiny challenges the narratives of purity and separation that often divide us. It reveals that our cultures have always been hybrids, our technologies have always been collaborations, and our greatest leaps forward have always relied on the free flow of knowledge across artificial borders. The forgotten corridors remind us that to be human is to be connected, and that our past, much like our present, was a collective project. Our journey through these silent highways ends with a simple, transformative truth. The world has always been connected. From the ocean floor to our very genes, we have traced the lines of an ancient web that bound humanity together across continents and millennia. Our ancestors were not primitive isolates waiting to be discovered. They were sophisticated networkers, diplomats of commerce, and explorers of the mind, whose exchanges of goods, ideas, and genetic legacy wrote the first chapters of our collective story. This reconstruction is far more than an academic puzzle solved. It is a profound reminder that interconnection is not a modern invention, but our species' default state. Diversity was never a barrier, it was the raw material. Exchange was not a luxury, it was the engine. And adaptation, born from encountering the new and the different, has always been the pulse of human progress. As you move through our hyper-connected present, scrolling through a global feed or holding a device assembled from minerals across 3 continents, remember you are walking in the footsteps of those ancient weavers. You are the inheritor of a dialogue that began when the first Lapis Lazuli stone was passed from a miner in Afghanistan to a trader bound for Mesopotamia. If this vision of a deeply linked past inspires you to see our modern world with new eyes, join us as we continue the search. Your curiosity fuels this exploration. Share in the comments which forgotten corridor captured your imagination most, and subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries that shape us. The map is still unfinished. Every new discovery, whether from a satellite scan or a museum basement, adds another vibrant thread to the magnificent, ever-growing tapestry of our shared human story.